The community thought it was just a tragic accident, until Google Maps revealed a hidden car. The dust hung in the August air, thick and golden, each mote a tiny sunbeam in the dying light. For 17 years, that dust had been the only thing that changed on Ridgeview Road. It settled on the same mailboxes, the same manicured lawns, the same placid, unblinking windows of the houses in the small, self-satisfied town of Harmony Creek. It was a town that prided itself on its quiet predictability, on the serene, untroubled rhythm of its days. Tragedies happened elsewhere, on the flickering blue light of the evening news, to people whose lives were messy and complicated. Not here. Here, there were only accidents. Unfortunate, sad, but ultimately, simple. That was what they called it. When 17-year-old Liam Hayes vanished, an accident. He'd been a troubled kid, they whispered over lukewarm coffee at the town diner. A boy with a storm in his eyes and a restlessness in his soul that didn't fit within the neat grid of Harmony Creek's streets. He drank, he fought, he loved his car, a beat-up '98 Honda Civic, the color of a faded bruise, more than he seemed to love most people. On the night of the annual Founders' Day picnic, after a public screaming fight with his girlfriend, Sarah, he'd peeled out of the town square, tires spitting gravel, and was never seen again. The official story, the one that settled over the town like a comforting blanket, was that he'd finally done what he'd always threatened to do. He'd run, or, in a more tragic version of the same story, he'd been drinking, lost control of his car on one of the winding back roads, and plunged into the murky depths of the Blackwood River, which snaked its way through the dense forest bordering the town. The river was deep, the current strong. The sheriff, a man named Frank Miller, whose face was a permanent mask of wary resignation, had organized a search. They'd dragged the river for a week. They'd found nothing. No car, nobody, just the vast indifferent silence of the water. Over time, the story hardened into fact. Liam Hayes had been a casualty of his own recklessness. A ghost story parents told their teenagers to scare them straight. His mother, a fragile woman named Clara, eventually moved away, unable to bear the constant, pitying glances. His girlfriend, Sarah, the golden girl of Harmony Creek, had cried her pretty tears, graduated, and married the town's golden boy, Mark Sterling, whose father owned half the businesses in town. Life, as it always did in Harmony Creek, went on. The dust settled. Until today, it started with a kid named Leo, a 10-year-old with a new drone and a thirst for adventure. That hadn't yet been leached out of him by the town's oppressive quiet. He was supposed to be mapping the creek for a school project, but the drone's camera, a high-definition eye in the sky, had drifted. It soared over the dense canopy of the Blackwood Forest, a place most people avoided. A place rumored to be full of ticks and old forgotten things. Leo was looking for a hawk's nest his grandfather had told him about. A speck of wildness in a world of trimmed hedges. He was watching the live feed on his tablet, his tongue stuck out in concentration, when he saw it. A flicker of unnatural color in the sea of green. It was a shape that didn't belong. A glint of metal and faded paint tucked away in a small, almost perfectly hidden clearing, accessible only by a long overgrown logging trail that hadn't been used in decades. It was a car. From his godlike vantage point, it looked like a toy, a forgotten dinky car left in the woods. He zoomed in. The color was a dull, purplish blue. Leo didn't know what it was, but he knew it was a secret. And secrets were the most valuable currency a 10-year-old could possess. He saved the GPS coordinates, his heart thumping a frantic, exhilarating rhythm against his ribs. The coordinates led Sheriff Frank Miller to a place he hadn't set foot in since he was a boy. A place that reeked of damp earth and decay. The air was heavy, still. The trees formed a claustrophobic ceiling, blocking out the sky. He had to use a machete to hack his way through the last 50 yards of thorny undergrowth, the branches clawing at his uniform. And then he saw it. The 1998 Honda Civic was impossibly, eerily preserved. It was nestled between 3 ancient oaks, as if it had been parked there deliberately. The tires were flat, sunk into years of accumulated leaf mold. A fine layer of green moss coated the roof and hood, and vines snaked their way up the doors, their tendrils creeping into the seams of the windows. But it was unmistakably the car. Liam Hayes's car. Frank felt a cold dread seep into his bones, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long, long time. This wasn't the scene of an accident. There were no skid marks, no shattered glass on the forest floor, no mangled guardrail on the distant road. The car was intact. The front bumper was pristine. It hadn't crashed. It had been driven here. Hidden. His deputy, a young, eager officer named Ben Carter, was breathing heavily behind him. "Sheriff, is that yeah?" Frank said, his voice a low rasp. "It's his." He walked a slow circle around the car, his boots crunching on the dry leaves. The windows were so fogged with grime and condensation that it was impossible to see inside. He wiped a sleeve across the driver's side window, his heart hammering against his ribs. He peered into the gloom. The first thing he saw was the dust, a thick, undisturbed blanket of it covering every surface. The dashboard, the steering wheel, the seats. It was a time capsule, untouched for 17 years. And then his eyes adjusted, and he saw the shape. Slumped in the driver's seat, tilted at an unnatural angle against the passenger side, was a human skeleton. The bones were a pale, yellowish white against the dark upholstery, a tattered flannel shirt, the same one Liam had been wearing the night he disappeared, clung to the ribcage. A pair of faded jeans covered the leg bones. One skeletal hand rested on the gearshift, the other lay in the lap, fingers curled into a permanent, silent gesture. The skull was tilted back, the empty eye sockets staring up at the moss-covered roof. A wave of nausea washed over Frank. He'd seen dead bodies before. Car accidents, hunting mishaps, suicides, but this was different. This was a boy he'd known. A boy he'd coached in Little League. A boy he had written off as just another runaway. "Oh God," Ben whispered, his face pale. "He's been here the whole time." Frank didn't answer. He was looking at the skull. At the back of it, even through the grime and the shadows, he could see it. A small dark hole, no bigger than a dime, just above the place where the spine would have met the bone. A perfect, circular fracture. It was a detail that screamed, that tore through the 17 years of silence and lies. It was a detail that had no place in the story of a tragic accident. It was the punctuation mark at the end of a very different kind of sentence. He felt the weight of those 17 years pressing down on him. The weight of his own complacency, his own willingness to accept the easy answer. The whole town had accepted it. It had been simpler that way. "Cleaner. Get on the radio," Frank ordered, his voice tight, strained. "Call it in. Seal off the access road. Nobody comes in or out. Nobody." As Ben fumbled for his radio, his hands shaking, Frank's gaze drifted to the passenger side of the car. There was something on the floor, half hidden under the skeleton's leg. A small leather-bound book, a diary. Its cover was warped and stained, but it was there. A voice from the grave. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow, that this car, this skeleton, this diary, was not just a relic of a forgotten tragedy. It was a bomb. A bomb that had been sitting here, silent and waiting, for 17 years. And it was about to detonate, right in the heart of Harmony Creek. Blowing away the dust and revealing the ugly, rotten truth that lay beneath, the truth. That someone in their quiet, peaceful town was not just a liar, but a murderer. And they had let them get away with it for nearly 2 decades. The quiet rhythm of the town was about to be shattered, and Frank knew, with a sickening lurch in his stomach, that the sound would be deafening. The first tremor was already shaking the ground beneath his feet. A low, ominous rumble that promised to bring the whole carefully constructed facade of Harmony Creek crashing down. He had failed Liam Hayes 17 years ago. He wouldn't fail him again. He reached for the car door handle, the cold metal, a shock against his skin. And the quiet of the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the secrets to come spilling out. The discovery of Liam Hayes's car sent a shockwave through Harmony Creek. A jolt that cracked the town's placid surface. The news spread, not like wildfire, but like a slow-moving poison, seeping into every home, every conversation. It was on the local news, a grim-faced reporter standing at the edge of the yellow police tape, the woods a dark, menacing backdrop. It was the only topic of conversation at the diner, the whispers now laced with a morbid, fearful excitement. A skeleton, in a car, hidden, for 17 years. The word accident was no longer spoken. A new, uglier word had taken its place: homicide. For Clara Hayes, the news was a physical blow. She was living in a small anonymous apartment 3 states away, a place she had chosen for its lack of memories. The call came from Sheriff Miller, his voice heavy with a guilt she could hear even over the crackle of the long-distance line. She listened, her hand gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white, as he told her what they had found. Her son, her Liam. Not lost to the river, not a runaway in some distant city, but left to rot in the woods. Just a few miles from the home where she had raised him. The grief she had tried to bury for 17 years erupted. A raw volcanic force. It wasn't the dull ache of loss she had grown accustomed to. It was a fresh, savage agony. The image of his skeleton, slumped in that car, burned itself into her mind. Her boy, who had been so full of life, so much angry, vibrant energy, reduced to a collection of bones in a flannel shirt. The official story had been a mercy, a lie that had allowed her to eventually, painstakingly, move on. This truth was a torment. It meant that his last moments had not been a tragic mistake, but a scene of terror. It meant that someone had hurt him, had taken his life, and had then simply walked away, leaving him to be consumed by the forest. She packed a single bag, her movements stiff, robotic. She had to go back. Back to the town that had so easily forgotten her son, back to the place where his killer still lived, breathing the same air, walking the same streets. The fragile peace she had built for herself was shattered. In its place was a cold, hard resolve. She would not be the broken, weeping mother they remembered. She would be his voice. She would find out who had done this. In a sprawling, immaculate house on the other side of town, Sarah Sterling, née Preston, also received a phone call. It was from her husband, Mark. His voice was tight, strained. "Turn on the news," he said, and then hung up. Sarah, now a perfectly coiffed, elegantly dressed woman of 34, the epitome of suburban grace, walked into her sun-drenched living room and switched on the large flat-screen TV. She saw the reporter, the police tape, the dark woods. She heard the name Liam Hayes, and the carefully constructed world she inhabited tilted on its axis. She sank onto a plush white sofa, her hand flying to her mouth. The years fell away, and she was 17 again, standing in the town square. The colored lights of the Founders' Day picnic blurring through her tears. She could feel the sting of Liam's words, the heat of their argument. He had been so angry, so jealous. He had accused her of flirting with Mark, which she had been. He had grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin, his eyes wild. "You're mine, Sarah," he had hissed, a desperate possessive edge to his voice that had scared her. She had pulled away, slapped him, and watched him storm off to his car. She had told the police that was the last time she saw him. It was a lie she had carried for 17 years, a small, dense stone in the pit of her stomach. The truth was, she had followed him. Worried, guilty, she had gotten into her own car and driven after him, trying to catch up, to apologize, to fix what they had broken. She had seen his bruised blue Civic turn onto the old logging trail, a place they used to go to be alone. She had followed, her headlights cutting through the darkness, and she had seen something else. Another car, a big, dark truck. Mark Sterling's truck. She had stopped, her heart pounding, and watched from a distance as Mark got out of his truck and walked over to Liam's car. They were arguing. She couldn't hear the words, but the gestures were violent, angry. And then, and then it had happened. A flash, a sound, like a firecracker, sharp and sudden. And she had seen Liam's body slump forward. Panic, cold, and absolute, had seized her. She had thrown her car into reverse, her tires squealing on the dirt, and she had fled. She had driven home, her body shaking, and had crawled into bed, pulling the covers over her head as if to block out the world. The next day, when the news of Liam's disappearance broke, she had said nothing. Mark had come to her, his face pale, his eyes pleading. "He was crazy, Sarah," he had whispered. "He would have hurt you. It was an accident. He had a gun. It went off. We have to forget this. For us." And she had chosen the easy path, the safe path. She had chosen Mark, and the life he could give her, a life of comfort and security. A life without the messy, unpredictable chaos of Liam Hayes. She had buried the memory so deep she had almost convinced herself it hadn't happened. But now, the grave was open. The skeleton was found. And the stone in her stomach was a boulder, threatening to crush her. Her perfect life, her perfect husband, her perfect town, it was all built on a foundation of lies, on the bones of a boy she had once loved. She looked at her hands. They were trembling. She was not just a witness, she was an accomplice. And then there was Mark Sterling. He was in his office, the one that had belonged to his father, a room of dark wood and expensive leather overlooking the town square. He watched the same news report, his face a stony, unreadable mask. He was the town's benefactor, the man who sponsored the Little League, who donated to the church, who sat on the board of every important committee. He was the pillar of the community. A good man, but as he watched the footage of the woods, a cold sweat trickled down his back. He remembered that night with a terrifying clarity. The rage that had consumed him when he saw Liam grab Sarah's arm. The feeling of his own power, his own entitlement. He was a Sterling. People didn't mess with the Sterlings. He had followed Liam, intending to teach him a lesson, to scare him away from Sarah for good. He had brought the gun for emphasis, a small pistol his father kept in the glove compartment of the truck. But Liam hadn't been scared. He had been defiant, his eyes burning with a hatred that matched Mark's own. They had fought a clumsy, desperate struggle in the cramped space of the car. And the gun had gone off. Mark hadn't meant to kill him. That's what he told himself. It was an accident. A tragic, stupid accident. But in the aftermath, in the terrifying silence that followed the gunshot, another instinct had taken over. The instinct for self-preservation. He couldn't go to the police. His father's name, his family's reputation, his own futurette would all be destroyed, so he had hidden him. He had driven Liam's car deeper into the woods, to a place no one would ever think to look. He had wiped his fingerprints from every surfacing. He had walked away, leaving Liam's body to the darkness and the silence. He had gone to Sarah, and together, they had built a new story, a new reality. Over the old one, for 17 years, it had held, but now, the past was clawing its way back to the surface. He looked out the window at the town square, at the people going about their lives, oblivious. They all looked up to him. They trusted him. He had spent his entire adult life building this facade, this image of the perfect man. And now, a 10-year-old boy with a drone and a skeleton in a flannel shirt were about to tear it all down. He felt a surge of that old familiar rage. He had gotten away with it for this long. He would not let them take it all away from him now. He would fight, he would lie. He would do whatever it took to keep his secret buried. The town of Harmony Creek had believed his story once. He would just have to make them believe it again. But this time, the stakes were infinitely higher. This time, it wasn't just about a girl. It was about his life. The return of Clara Hayes was a quiet affair, unmarked by the fanfare that now surrounded her son's death. She drove into Harmony Creek in a nondescript sedan, her face pale and drawn, her eyes scanning the familiar streets with a stranger's detachment. The town looked the same, yet everything was different. The quaint storefronts, the tidy houses, the very air itself seemed tainted, complicit in the long silence. She checked into the town's only motel, a drab, soulless place on the highway, and the first person she called was Sheriff Frank Miller. They met in his office, a room that smelled of stale coffee and old paper. Frank looked older than she remembered, the lines on his face deeper, his shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. He couldn't meet her eyes. "Clara, I'm so sorry," he began, his voice a low rumble of guilt. Clara held up a hand, cutting him off. She had not come for apologies. Apologies were useless things, empty words that could not turn back time or mend a shattered life. "Tell me everything, Frank," she said, her voice steady, devoid of the tears he had expected. "Everything you know." He hesitated, then slid a thin file across the desk. It contained the preliminary autopsy report. She opened it, her hands surprisingly steady. She read the clinical detached language, ... single gunshot wound to the occipital bone. Projectile recovered from the cranial cavity. Consistent with a small caliber firearm. The words were cold, sterile, yet they painted a picture of such intimate, final violence that she had to close her eyes for a moment. "The diary," she said, looking up. "You mentioned a diary." Frank nodded, retrieving a large evidence bag from a locked drawer. Inside was the warped, water-stained leather book. "We're still trying to make it legible. The humidity did a lot of damage, but we've managed to recover a few entries from the last days." He laid out the digitally enhanced printouts on the desk. The handwriting was Liam's, a messy, angry scrawl that she knew as well as her own. Her heart ached as she read the words, a voice reaching out to her from across the chasm of death. "She's with him all the time now, Sterling. He looks at her like she's something he owns. And she just lets him. She smiles that smile, the one she used to give me. Doesn't she see what he is? What his whole family is? They own this whole damn town, and they think they can own her too." Another entry, dated the day of the Founders' Day picnic. "He threatened me today. Mark told me to stay away from Sarah. He had his buddies with him, laughing like a pack of hyenas. He said if I didn't, he'd make me disappear." He said it with a smile on his face, like it was a joke. But his eyes weren't joking. "I'm going to talk to her tonight. I have to make her see." Clara's breath caught in her throat. There it was. A threat, a motive, a name. "Mark Sterling," she whispered, the name tasting like poison on her tongue. Frank sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "Clara, I know what this looks like, but a teenage threat from 17 years ago, it's not enough. The Sterlings are the most powerful family in this county. Mark is practically the mayor. I can't just go after him based on this. I need more. I need something concrete." "So you're not going to do anything?" she asked, a dangerous edge creeping into her voice. "I'm going to investigate," he corrected her gently. "I'm re-interviewing everyone who was there that night, starting with Sarah and Mark Sterling." The interview took place in the Sterlings' living room, a sterile white space that felt more like a museum than a home. Mark sat in a large armchair, his hands steepled, the picture of calm authority. Sarah sat beside him on the sofa, her posture rigid, her face a mask of practiced sorrow. "It's just so shocking," she said, her voice a soft, breathy whisper. "After all these years, to find out he was there, all along. It's horrible." Frank watched them both, his old cop instincts humming. He'd known them their whole lives. He'd watched Mark grow from an arrogant, athletic teenager into a polished, powerful man. He'd watched Sarah blossom from the pretty, popular cheerleader into the perfect society wife. They were the town's royalty. But now, sitting in their pristine living room, he saw something else. He saw the faint, almost invisible cracks in their perfect facade. "Mark," Frank said, turning his attention to him. "Liam wrote in his diary that you threatened him, that you told him you'd make him disappear." Mark laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Frank, we were 17. We were rivals for the same girl. We said a lot of stupid things. You can't, seriously, be putting any stock in that." "Did you follow him that night?" Frank asked, his gaze unwavering. "No," Mark said, his voice firm, unwavering. "I was with my friends. After Liam and Sarah had their fight, we all went over to Billy Peterson's house. We were there all night. You can ask any of them. It was a perfect alibi, a wall of respected names from good families." Frank knew it would be unshakable. He turned to Sarah, And you, Sarah? What did you do after Liam left? Sarah flinched, a barely perceptible movement. She looked at Mark, a quick, fleeting glance, before turning back to Frank. I was upset. My friends took me home. My parents can confirm that. I stayed in my room all night. Another perfect alibi, a dead end. But as Frank watched them, he saw the way Sarah's hands were twisting a silk cushion into knots. The way Mark's jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle jumped in his cheek. They were lying. He knew it with every fiber of his being. But knowing and proving were two different things. While Frank hit a wall of well-rehearsed lies, Clara began her own quiet investigation. She was a ghost in her own town, a forgotten mother whose grief had been conveniently swept under the rug. She walked the streets, her presence a silent accusation. She went to the library and pulled up the old high school yearbooks, her fingers tracing the faces of the teenagers who were now the town's adults. Mark Sterling, his arm slung possessively around Sarah, his smile radiating a smug confidence. Liam, in the back row of the football team photo, his expression defiant. A loner, even in a crowd. She found what she was looking for in the microfiche archives of the local paper, a photo from the Founders' Day picnic. Taken just hours before Liam disappeared. It showed a laughing crowd gathered around a bonfire. In the foreground, Sarah was looking up at Mark, her face illuminated by the flames, her expression one of pure adoration. And in the background, almost lost in the shadows, was Liam. He was watching them, his face a mask of raw, unfiltered anguish. The pain in his eyes was so palpable, it reached across the years and tore at Clara's heart. But there was someone else in the photo, someone she hadn't noticed at first. A boy standing near Liam, half hidden behind a tree. He was a quiet, nerdy kid, she vaguely remembered. A boy named David Chen. He had been on the AV club with Liam. In the photo, he wasn't looking at the bonfire or the happy couple. He was looking at Liam, his expression one of deep concern. He was a witness to Liam's pain. And maybe, just maybe, he had been a witness to more. Finding David Chen was not easy. He had left Harmony Creek right after graduation and had never come back. There was no trace of him online, no social media presence. It was as if he, too, had vanished. Clara spent days making phone calls, tracking down old classmates, following a breadcrumb trail of faint memories. Finally, a former teacher gave her a possible lead, a tech company in Seattle. She found him listed on the company's website. He was a senior software engineer. She stared at his corporate headshot, a picture of a serious, bespectacled man in his mid-30s. The scared, nerdy boy from the yearbook was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he had built a fortress around himself. She booked a flight to Seattle. She met him in a sterile, anonymous coffee shop near his office. He was nervous, his eyes darting around as if he expected to be ambushed. He had agreed to meet her only after she had pleaded with him on the phone, her voice raw with a mother's desperation. "I don't know anything," he said before she could even speak, his voice low, rushed. "It was a long time ago. I don't remember." "David," Clara said, her voice gentle but firm. "I saw the picture. From the picnic. You were there. You saw how upset Liam was." David took a sharp breath, his gaze dropping to the table. He stirred his coffee, the spoon clinking nervously against the ceramic. "Liam was my friend," he whispered, his voice cracking. "My only friend." The confession, when it came, was a torrent of words held back for 17 years, a flood of guilt and fear. "I saw it," he said, finally looking at her, his eyes swimming with tears. "I saw everything." He told her that he had been worried about Liam after the fight. He had seen the look in Mark Sterling's eyes. He had seen the way Mark and his friends had cornered Liam earlier that day. So like Sarah, he had followed Liam. He had stayed back, hidden in the trees, a silent, terrified observer. "I saw Mark's truck," he stammered, his body trembling. "He blocked Liam's car," they argued. It was loud, violent. Then, Mark pulled out a gun. Liam tried to fight him. There was a struggle, and the gun went off. Clara listened, her blood turning to ice. Her son's last moments were playing out in front of her. A horror film narrated by a terrified witness. I should have done something, David choked, tears now streaming down his face. I should have screamed, called the police, but I was 16. I was terrified. Mark Sterling saw me. After it happened, he looked right at me. He didn't say anything, he just smiled. It was the scariest thing I've ever seen. It was a promise that if I ever said a word, the same thing would happen to me. David had run home, packed a bag, and convinced his parents to let him go live with his aunt in another state. He had never told a soul. The secret had been a cancer, eating away at him for 17 years, shaping his life. Turning him into a recluse who trusted no one, Clara reached across the table and took his shaking hand. She felt not anger, but a profound, aching pity for this man, who had been just a boy. Trapped by a fear she could only imagine. It's not too late to do the right thing, David, she said softly. He looked at her, his face a ruin of old fear and newfound resolve. He knew she was right. But the image of Mark Sterling's smiling face, a mask of pure, confident evil, was burned into his memory. Going to the police meant going back to Harmony Creek. It meant facing the man who had haunted his nightmares for half his life. It was a terrifying prospect. But as he looked into the eyes of this grieving mother, he knew he had no other choice. The silence had to be broken. The return of David Chen to Harmony Creek was like a stone dropped into a still pond, the ripples spreading outwards, disturbing the murky depths. His testimony, given to Sheriff Miller in the same small office where Clara had read her son's autopsy report, was a bombshell. It was the concrete evidence Frank had been waiting for. A first-hand account that directly contradicted the rock-solid alibis of Mark and Sarah Sterling. It was a story of jealousy, rage, and a murder that had been concealed for 17 years by fear and power. Armed with David's sworn statement, Frank felt a surge of adrenaline, the old fire of the hunt reigniting in his belly. He finally had a weapon to wield against the Sterling Empire, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. Mark Sterling was not just a man, he was an institution. His lawyers were the best money could buy, and his influence ran deep. A network of favors and obligations that held the town in its grip. The first move was to bring Mark in for questioning again. This time, it wasn't a polite chat in his living room. It was a formal interrogation at the station, under the harsh fluorescent lights of a small windowless room. Mark arrived with his lawyer, a slick, expensive-looking man from the city. He was the picture of indignation, his face a mask of offended innocence. "This is harassment." "Frank," he said, his voice cold, controlled. "You're dredging up a 17-year-old tragedy and trying to pin it on me, based on the ramblings of some neurotic computer geek who ran away from his own shadow." Frank leaned forward, his hands flat on the metal table. "David Chen saw you, Mark. He saw you kill Liam Hayes." Mark's composure didn't crack. He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. He saw a struggle, he heard a noise. He was a scared kid in the dark. His memory is unreliable, suggestible, and he has no proof. He saw the gun, Mark, Frank pressed, a small caliber pistol. The same caliber that killed Liam. "Lots of people own guns in this town," the lawyer interjected smoothly. "You have no weapon, no ballistics to match. You have nothing." They were right. It was one man's word against another's, and in Harmony Creek. The word of a Sterling was worth more than the word of a Chen. Frank watched Mark's eyes. They were cold, flat, devoid of any emotion except a chilling, reptilian self-assurance. He was untouchable, and he knew it. Frank released him, the taste of defeat bitter in his mouth. The escalation was immediate and brutal. The next day, David Chun's name was leaked to the local press. The headline read, "Key witness in Hayes case has history of psychiatric issues." The article, quoting anonymous sources, painted David as a deeply troubled, unstable individual who had suffered from anxiety and paranoia since adolescence. It was a character assassination, swift and vicious. Mark Sterling was fighting back, not in the interrogation room, but in the court of public opinion. David, who was staying at the same motel as Clara, was terrified. "How did they know that?" he asked, his voice trembling as he held the newspaper. "I saw a therapist when I was a teenager. It was confidential." "The Sterlings have long arms, David," Clara said, her voice grim. "They're trying to discredit you. To silence you." The pressure mounted. David's employer in Seattle, called the board, was uncomfortable with the negative publicity. He was placed on indefinite leave, his digital life was attacked. His old social media accounts hacked, embarrassing posts from his youth dredged up and circulated. He became a pariah, the town's new bogeyman. People whispered about him in the diner, pointing at the man who was trying to tear down their town's hero. Mark Sterling, meanwhile, played the part of the grieving friend, the wronged man. He gave an exclusive interview to a regional news channel, his arm wrapped around a tearful Sarah. Liam was a troubled soul, Mark said, his voice thick with false emotion. "We all tried to help him. This accusation, it's like being stabbed in the back. It's tearing our family, and this whole community, apart. All we want is for the truth to come out, and for Liam to finally rest in peace." It was a masterful performance. He was turning himself into the victim, and David into the villain. The town, desperate to believe in the simple, comfortable reality he represented, was starting to side with him. Clara felt a cold, rising dread. She saw what was happening. Mark was using his power and influence to crush the truth, to bury her son all over again. She saw the fear in David's eyes, a fear so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. He was starting to waver, to doubt his decision to come forward. "Maybe I should just go," he said one evening, his face pale and haggard. "They're going to destroy me, Clara. What's the point? No one will ever believe me over him." "I believe you," Clara said, her voice fierce. "And my son's memory believes you. We can't let him win, David, we can't." But she knew that words were not enough. They needed more than one man's testimony. They needed something undeniable. Something that even the Sterling money couldn't bury. The cruelty escalated. One night, a rock shattered the window of David's motel room. A note was tied around it. "Go home," it said in crude, block letters. The threat was clear. Frank put a police guard on the motel, but it was a small comfort. The town itself felt hostile, menacing. The friendly faces had turned cold. The quiet streets now seemed to hold a silent threat. Sarah Sterling was living in a gilded cage of fear. The reappearance of the past had shattered her carefully constructed peace. She played the part of the supportive wife, standing by Mark's side, smiling for the cameras. But at night, in the darkness of their sprawling empty house, the facade crumbled. She watched her husband, saw the cold, ruthless determination in his eyes, and she was terrified. This was not the charming, confident boy she had fallen in love with. This was a stranger, a man capable of a chilling brutality she had never allowed herself to see. She remembered the look on his face that night in the woods, the look of a predator. Her guilt was a physical thing, a constant weight in her chest. She had been there, she had seen it. Her silence had made all of this possible. She had traded a boy's life for her own comfort and security. The thought was a poison, sickening her from the inside out. One evening, Mark came home late, smelling of whiskey and rage. He had been with his lawyers, planning his defense. He found Sarah in the living room, staring blankly at the dark TV screen. "What's wrong with you?" he snapped, his voice sharp. "You've been moping around for days. You need to pull yourself together. We have to present a united front." "I can't do this anymore, Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't keep lying." His face darkened. He crossed the room in 2 strides and grabbed her by the arms, his fingers digging into her flesh, just as Liam's had done all those years ago. The irony was so bitter it made her want to scream. "Listen to me," he hissed, his face close to hers. "You will do nothing, you will say nothing. You are a part of this, Sarah. You made your choice 17 years ago. You chose me, you chose this life. Don't even think about throwing it all away now. Because if I go down, I swear to God, I will take you with me. He released her, shoving her back onto the sofa. She looked at him, at the ugly, violent stranger he had become, and she finally understood. She was not his partner. She was his prisoner. Her silence was the lock on her own cage. The fear she had felt for 17 years was nothing compared to the terror she felt now. She was trapped, and the only person who held the key was the man who had committed murder. The injustice of it all was a suffocating weight. Liam was dead. David was being crucified, and she, the other witness, was being held hostage by the killer. The conflict was no longer just about the past. It was about her own survival, and she was starting to realize that staying silent might be the most dangerous choice of all. The turning point came from the last place anyone expected it. It came from the car. Sheriff Miller, frustrated by the wall of silence and intimidation erected by the Sterlings, had sent every piece of evidence from Liam's Honda to the state crime lab for a more thorough analysis. He wasn't expecting much. After 17 years in the damp woods, the car was a forensic nightmare. But he had to try everything. Weeks passed, the town remained locked in a tense stalemate. David Chen was a virtual prisoner in his motel room, his reputation in tatters. Mark Sterling continued to play the part of the wronged pillar of the community, while privately tightening his grip on Sarah, whose fear and guilt were visibly eating away at her. Clara Hayes waited, a specter of patient, relentless grief. Her presence a constant, silent reminder of the unanswered questions. Then, the call came. It was from a young, sharp-eyed technician at the crime lab. "Sheriff," she said, a note of excitement in her voice. "I think we've got something. Something you need to see." Frank drove the 2 hours to the state capitol himself. The technician, a woman named Anya Sharma, led him into a sterile lab. On a large monitor, she pulled up a series of higher-resolution images. They were of the car's interior, specifically the dashboard. The car's radio was an aftermarket model, Anya explained, pointing to the screen. AJVC, popular in the late 90s. It had a detachable faceplate, but this one also had a feature that was pretty rare at the time. A built-in voice recorder. It could record up to 60 seconds of audio. A little memo function. Frank stared at the image of the dusty, antiquated radio. And it still works. The internal battery was long dead, of course, she said. But the memory chip, a little flash storage unit, was sealed. We had to carefully extract it and rebuild the power pathway, but we were able to recover the last recording. Frank's heart began to pound. "Play it," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Anya clicked a button on her keyboard. A crackle of static filled the lab, the sound of 17 years of silence. And then, a voice. Liam's voice. Young, angry, desperate, ... "Get away from me. Mark, I'm not afraid of you." There was the sound of a struggle, a grunt of effort, fabric tearing. Then another voice. Mark Sterling's voice. Not the polished, confident tone of the town benefactor, but the raw, snarling voice of a teenage bully. "You think you can just take what's mine? She's not for you, you piece of trash. I'll kill you before I let you have her." Another sound. A girl's voice, screaming. A single, terrified word. Liam. It was Sarah. Frank felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Sarah had been there. She had lied. She had been at the scene of the crime. But the recording wasn't over. There was another grunt, more struggling, and then Liam's voice again, strained, breathless. "The gun, ... Mark, no." And then, the sound. The sharp, deafening crack of a gunshot. It was followed by a moment of perfect, chilling silence. And then, one final sound. The sound of a girl sobbing, a desperate, broken sound. Sarah. The recording ended. Frank stood frozen, the voices echoing in the sterile lab. It was the smoking gun, an audio recording of the murder itself. It was undeniable, irrefutable proof. It captured the threat, the struggle, the gunshot, and most damningly, the presence of two people who had sworn they were somewhere else entirely. The full, ugly conspiracy was laid bare. This wasn't just Mark Sterling, the hot-headed teenager, killing a rival in a fit of rage. This was Mark Sterling, the murderer, and Sarah Preston, the witness, conspiring to hide the truth. Her silence wasn't just the result of fear, it was an act of complicity. She had helped him create the lie, had helped him bury Liam, not just in the woods, but under 17 years of deception. Her tears on the recording were not just of grief, but of a girl who had just watched her lover be murdered and had chosen the killer over the victim. The stakes had just shifted seismically. This was no longer a personal tragedy. It was a public scandal of the highest order. It implicated the town's most powerful man and his seemingly perfect wife. It was a story of murder, lies, and a cover-up that had corrupted the very heart of Harmony Creek. Frank felt a cold, hard fury rise in him. For 17 years, Mark Sterling had walked free, building a life, a family, a reputation, on the grave of a boy he had murdered. He had intimidated a witness into silence, slandered another, and manipulated an entire town. And his wife, the Golden Girl, had stood by his side, her hands just as dirty. "Get me a copy of that," Frank said to Anya, his voice tight with controlled rage, "and get me 2 arrest warrants. One for Mark Sterling, for the murder of Liam Hayes, and one for Sarah Sterling, for accessory to murder and obstruction of justice." He walked out of the lab and into the sunlight, but he felt no warmth. He was holding a ghost in his hand, a 60-second recording that would tear Harmony Creek apart. The tension that had been simmering for weeks was about to explode. There would be no more quiet whispers, no more polite lies. There would only be the raw, ugly, undeniable truth, played out for all to hear. The cinematic payoff was coming, and Frank knew it would be a spectacle of justice and ruin that the town would never forget. He got in his car and drove back towards Harmony Creek, the audio file a ticking time bomb on the seat beside him. The trial of Mark and Sarah Sterling was not just a legal proceeding. It was the event that broke Harmony Creek. The small county courthouse was besieged by news vans, their satellite dishes pointing to the sky like a forest of metallic trees. The story had gone national, a lurid tale of teenage love, jealousy, and a murder concealed for nearly 2 decades in a picture-perfect small town. It was a Netflix documentary come to life, and the world was watching. The courtroom was packed. Every day, a tense, suffocating theater of whispers and stares. On one side sat Clara Hayes, a pillar of quiet, unyielding strength, with David Chen beside her. No longer looking like a terrified boy, but a man finally unburdened by a terrible secret. On the other side sat Mark Sterling, flanked by his hype lawyers, his face a mask of arrogant defiance. But the real spectacle was Sarah. She sat slightly apart from her husband, her face pale and gaunt, the picture of a fallen angel. The weight of her 17-year lie had finally broken her. The prosecution's case was methodical, devastating. They presented the forensic evidence, the autopsy results, David Chen's harrowing eyewitness testimony. But the trial, and the town's fate, hinged on the moment the prosecutor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Maria Flores, announced she was playing the audio recording from Liam's car. A hush fell over the courtroom. The clerk placed a speaker on the witness stand. Flores pressed a button. The crackle of static filled the air, a sound from another time. And then, the voices. Liam's angry, defiant words. Mark's snarling threat. The sounds of the struggle. The entire courtroom held its breath, leaning forward as if to catch every ghostly syllable. When Sarah's terrified scream of Liam echoed through the room, a collective gasp went through the gallery. People turned to stare at Sarah Sterling, who flinched as if she'd been struck. Her eyes shutting tight. Then came the final, damning sounds. Liam's desperate plea, the gunshots so loud and sharp in the silent room that several people cried out, and finally, the sound of a young girl's broken, ragged sobs. When the recording ended, the silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence filled with 17 years of buried truth. Mark Sterling's face was ashen. His mask of confidence had shattered, replaced by the stark, ugly face of a killer caught in a trap of his own making. But the most dramatic moment was yet to come. The prosecution called its final witness. The people call Sarah Sterling to the stand. A wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. Mark's lawyer leaped to his feet, objecting, citing spousal privilege. But the judge overruled him. Sarah was not just a spouse. She was a co-conspirator, charged with a crime. She could not refuse to testify. Her movements were slow, robotic, as she walked to the stand. She looked like a ghost, her eyes hollow, fixed on some distant point in the past. She did not look at her husband. She did not look at anyone. She swore the oath, her voice a barely audible whisper. Flores approached her gently. "Mrs. Sterling," she began, her voice soft, "you have been charged as an accessory to this crime, but the district attorney's office is prepared to offer you a deal, full immunity, in exchange for the whole truth. Tell this court, tell Clara Hayes, what happened on the night Liam Hayes was killed." Mark's lawyer was screaming objections, but the judge silenced him with a bang of his gavel. All eyes were on Sarah. She was trembling, her hands gripping the edge of the witness box. She looked up, her gaze finally sweeping across the courtroom. She saw the faces of the people she had known her whole life, their expressions a mixture of pity and contempt. She saw Clara Hayes, her face a mask of profound, patient sorrow. And finally, she looked at her husband. She saw the rage in his eyes, the silent, desperate threat. And in that moment, something inside her broke. The fear that had held her captive for 17 years was finally burned away by the fire of her own self-loathing. She had lost everything already: her reputation, her peace, her soul. The only thing she had left to lose was the lie she took. A deep, shuddering breath and turned to the jury. "I lied," she said, her voice cracking, but clear and strong. "I lied to the police. I lied to everyone. I was there." The confession poured out of her, a torrent of guilt and regret. She told them everything: how she had followed Liam, how she had seen Mark confront him. She described the fight, the gun, the look of shock and betrayal on Liam's face as he fell. "And what did you do then, Mrs. Sterling?" Flores asked gently. After Mark Sterling shot Liam Hayes, Sarah began to sob, her body shaking with the force of her confession. "I did nothing," she choked out. "I just watched. And then he came to me. Mark. He told me it was an accident. He told me we had to hide him, for us, for our future. And I helped him. I stayed quiet. I let everyone believe he was a runaway. I let his mother grieve for a boy who wasn't lost, but who was rotting in the woods, just a few miles away. I chose him. I chose this life, and it was a mistake. It was a horrible, unforgivable mistake." She turned to Clara Hayes, her eyes pleading, swimming in tears. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "I am so sorry." It was the bombshell that sealed the verdict. The jury was out for less than an hour. They came back with their decision. Guilty on all counts. Mark Sterling for first-degree murder. Sarah Sterling for accessory after the fact and obstruction of justice. The moment the foreman read the verdict, the courtroom erupted. Clara Hayes finally broke, her body slumping forward as sobs of relief and grief shook her. David Chen put a comforting arm around her. On the other side of the room, Mark Sterling, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage, lunged towards his wife, screaming her name, a final impotent burst of fury before deputies tackled him and dragged him from the courtroom. The cinematic payoff was complete. Justice, public and explosive, had been delivered. The pillar of the community was a convicted murderer. The perfect wife was a disgraced accomplice. The lie that had held Harmony Creek together for 17 years had been obliterated in a public spectacle of truth and ruin. The town would never be the same. The dust had been blown away, and the foundation beneath was rotten to the core. For the first time in a long time, the air in Harmony Creek, though thick with the debris of shattered lives, felt clean. The seasons turned in Harmony Creek, washing over the raw wound of the trial. The news vans left, the national attention faded, and the town was left to grapple with its own reflection in the shattered mirror of the past. The name Sterling, once a symbol of power and prestige, was now a mark of shame. The Sterling businesses were sold, the family name fading into a cautionary tale whispered by a new generation. Clara Hayes did not stay. There was nothing left for her in Harmony Creek but ghosts. Before she left, she had a new stone placed in the town cemetery. It was simple, elegant granite, and it stood next to the empty plot that had been reserved for her. The stone read, "Liam Hayes' beloved son lost and finally found, may he rest in truth." She held a small private memorial service. The only other person in attendance was David Chen. They stood before the grave, two solitary figures bound by a shared, tragic history. The air was crisp. The autumn leaves a riot of gold and red around them. "Thank you, David," Clara said, her voice soft. "For everything, for your courage." David looked at the headstone, his expression one of sober reflection. The trial had changed him. The terrified boy was gone, replaced by a man who had faced his greatest fear and survived. He had lost his job, his privacy, his anonymity. But he had regained something far more valuable, his conscience. "He was my friend," David said simply. "I owed him the truth." They stood in silence for a long time, the quiet of the cemetery, a peaceful counterpoint to the storm they had weathered. When Clara finally turned to leave, she felt not closure that was a myth. A word for stories, not for life, but a sense of peace. The rage that had fueled her for so long had subsided, leaving behind the deep, enduring ache of a mother's love. Her son had a name again. He had a story. And now, he had a place to rest. Sarah Sterling received a lighter sentence for her testimony. 5 years with the possibility of parole in 3. She served her time in a low-security women's prison, a world away from the sun-drenched living rooms and society luncheons she had once inhabited. She refused all visitors. She spent her days in the prison library, reading, thinking, trying to understand the girl she had been, the woman she had become. The guilt was her constant companion, a shadow from which she could never escape. When she was finally released, she did not return to Harmony Creek. She moved to a large, anonymous city and found a quiet job working at an animal shelter, a place where the currency was kindness, not lies. She lived a small, solitary life, a life of penance, forever haunted by the memory of a gunshot in the dark woods. Mark Sterling would spend the rest of his life in a maximum security prison. He never showed remorse, never admitted his guilt. He maintained his innocence with a bitter, simmering rage, writing endless, rambling appeals from his cell. He grew old and gray behind bars, a forgotten monster in a cage, his power and influence reduced to nothing. He died of a heart attack in his cell at the age of 62, a lonely, bitter man. His name, a footnote in the dark history of a town that had long since moved on. Years later, a young couple, new to Harmony Creek, were hiking in the Blackwood Forest. They were exploring the old, overgrown trails, drawn by the wild, untamed beauty of the place. They stumbled upon a small clearing, a place where the trees grew in a rough circle, as if standing guard. In the center of the clearing, there was a slight depression in the earth, a place where a heavy object had once rested for a very long time. Vines and wildflowers had grown over the spot, reclaiming it for the forest, but if you looked closely, you could still see the faint outline of 4 tires in the soft earth. And here and there, glinting in the dappled sunlight, were tiny, scattered shards of tempered glass, like frozen tears. It was a quiet, unassuming place, a place that held no obvious meaning. But it was a scar on the land, a faint topographical memory of the car, the boy, and the secret that had been kept there for 17 years. A haunting, silent reminder of the cost of truth, and the way the past, no matter how deeply it is buried, never truly goes away. It simply waits, patiently, for the dust to settle, and for the light to catch it at just the right angle.